Just wait a second. Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining us in another series of our CPD in 43. Today we're joined by Carl from THY and Neil from Honeywell Gent. This is a CPD on Comply, Stay Alive Fire Technology. It should be a really interesting talk looking at all sorts of systems that you can implement in regard to various types of buildings. Obviously, with fire technology, it's a very, very pertinent subject, especially at the moment with all sorts of things happening to building regulations, planning, etc., and just generally a more higher awareness of this. So we not only have this talk today, which I'll hand straight over in a moment, but we also have a number of other events. The one in particular I'll highlight is the Wednesday, the 17th of November. We have a fire safety design with CPD, which will be highlighting current guidance, legislation, and common design issues from Hydrock. So that will be specifically on fire, so very much related to today. So that will be on a much more technical basis on policy, etc. Beforehand, so between this talk and Hydrock's talk in November, we've got a talk from Savills, which will be given a planning and regeneration update, so planning policy changes, etc. That'll be on Wednesday, the 29th of September, and then we'll have a talk from Autodesk, which is the journey from design automation to generative design, which will be on Wednesday, the 13th of October. So hopefully we'll have everyone signed up to these events. As you can see, Savills is the only one that is currently published, but these two obviously a sneak peek to highlight that these will be coming on the Eventbrite page very soon. So please do keep an eye out. If you're on the Site Central email list, then you should be also receiving an email in due course. As usual, just before I go, please do field questions to the chat box. If you have any queries, etc., just please, again, go to the chat box. So I'll be handing it straight over to Carl, and I'll disappear into the background. But thank you to Carl and Neil, and I'll hand it straight over to you guys.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. Obviously, I'd like to talk to you around sort of fire. I've brought Neil today with us from Honeywell Gent. For you that don't know about THY, we've been involved in fire systems for 27 years. We're more focused on the design and installation services. And in the last few years, we've been fortunate enough to partner up with Gent as an integrator, which is sort of the sort of top, I suppose, one of the top fire systems in the UK and the world. And there's only sort of 100 installers on the network. TH White involved in lots of different things, from fire and security to electric vehicle charge points to solar PV to general electrical. So I think obviously the best person to speak to you about the product and the solution is Neil. So I will hand you over to Neil, and he'll talk you through the presentation.
Thank you very much, Carl. So yeah, thanks for joining us all today. So we've got a CPD today on called Comply, Stay Alive, which I'll launch straight into in a minute. I'm actually going to turn my camera off because it's quite video intensive, and I think all the bandwidth we can get will be beneficial. So hopefully you can see my screen, and we'll launch straight into it then. So we talk about fire systems. Some people love them or loathe them. They're there to stay. And most people see fire systems as, they're rarely needed. You don't have fires tend to be every day. So we see them as, in many ways an inconvenience. They don't always tend to be thought about when building buildings, and they tend to be installed to meet legal requirements, literally because they need to get a building open. You need a fire alarm system. Well, we're going to talk today about that. But the key thing is, in the unlikely event, fire systems can save your life by making you aware there's a fire. That's its job, to get people out of the building. It can save your buildings and assets, but only if everyone is aware of the fire procedure and evacuation strategy. And it's around that today that we're going to be looking at. We've got some videos to share on that. So the CPD is based around the fatal inquiry at Rose Park, where many people have heard of that. We're going to look at what went wrong, the latest legislation standards that are in place, the documentation and responsibilities, and what happens if you get it wrong. So it's not so much product today, it's about understanding the standards and what we need to do as professionals to make sure the correct fire alarm systems get installed in the first place. So when it comes to any fire alarm system, some key stages that we need to consider. The first one is risk assessment. I will talk about a risk assessment a lot as we go through this presentation. You need a risk assessment, and we'll touch on that in the next few slides. We need to make sure the fire alarm system is designed with the relevant standards. In the UK, it's BS 5839 Part 1, the 2017 edition. Make sure we identify the category of system, so what type of fire alarm system needs to be installed. What's the fire evacuation plan? Because it's great having a fire alarm system, but if you don't have a plan of how everyone evacuates, it's a non-starter. There's some other standards you need to take into account, and we'll touch on those again. Make sure staff are trained, and that's key, as you'll see as we go through the videos. Make sure your fire alarm system is maintained correctly, and ultimately adapt the fire alarm system and your risk assessment as the occupants or the building changes going forward. So just going to set the scene. I've got to remember to play a different video. We're going to set the scene of the actual Rose Park itself, and it's a typical 1990s sort of care home. So I'm just going to play the video now, and yeah, have a look through it.
Rose Park Care Home Case Study, based on the findings of a fatal accident inquiry by Sheriff Brian Lockhart. The fatal accident inquiry was conducted between 2009 and 2010. The Sheriff Principal's determination from the FAI was published on 20th April 2011. This case study focuses on the tragic events on the 31st of January 2004, in which a fire in a care home killed 14 elderly residents. The main aspects of this study will provide information on the overview of the care home, the call to the fire service, the internal layout of the care home and its failures in fire safety, how the fire started and spread, and finally the actions of the care home staff and fire service on the night. Rose Park Care Home, built in the early 1990s, opened its doors in February 1992 and catered for residents of varying dependency. It is situated in the Uddingston area of Lanarkshire. The building is positioned within the local community and is split over 2 levels, with accommodation for its residents spread over the 2. It has a capacity for 43, 18 on the upper level and 25 on the lower. In its construction, there were no statutory requirement for sprinklers to be installed within care homes, and none were installed. The statutory requirement to carry out a fire risk assessment had not been carried out. This should have identified worst case scenarios, fires at night, means of escape and emergency procedures for staff to follow. With the care home constructed on a sloping site, the lower floor starts halfway towards the rear of the building. The main entrance to the building is on the upper level. The rear access to the building is on the lower level, which is through a gated entrance. A lane runs parallel to the side of the building, which gives access from the rear gate to the main entrance. The postcode given to the care home, G716LL, is situated on New Edinburgh Road, which is the rear access to the building. The distance from Bellshill Fire Station is 0.7 miles, and the journey time by blue light is 109 seconds. Failures in fire safety played a critical role in the deaths of the 14 residents. This shows the internal layout of the 2 floors within the building. On the upper level, the main entrance to the entrance foyer is located here, with offices just off it. The dining area, kitchen and lounge are located here. Accommodation is positioned off the corridors with access to the lower floor by stairs and lift. The sub-electrical switch is located in the cupboard. On the lower floor, there are exits from the building. There is further accommodation on this level, the boiler room and the sub-electrical switch.
Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of the actual building itself. I'll try and get back to the presentation now. There we go. There we go. So a couple of things that we picked out from that video there. Okay, one thing they said was the fire risk assessment hadn't been carried out. During subsequent investigations into this, and bear in mind it went to court 3 times, they found that a risk assessment had been carried out, but it was deemed not suitable or sufficient for this type of building. One of the things that was picked up on the video there, I don't know if anyone heard, was the time it takes to get from Bellshill Station to the actual care home by blue light, i.e. how long it would take from a phone call for the fire service to attend. And they said just under 109 seconds, so under 2 minutes. And it's worth remembering that in the next couple of videos. Okay, so current legislation, what's available out there? What do we need to pay attention to as professionals? Well, there's the Fire and Rescue Service Act 2004 that we need to be aware of, and that's the kind of first document that started to blame people if things went wrong. So if someone was at fault, they'd blame the company the person worked for. It's the first kind of place where we really started to see blame. Then in 2010 came out the Equality Act, also known as, well, previously known as the Disability Discrimination Act, that came out in 1995. So you need to be aware of that. But then in 2005 came the Regulatory Reform Order, and that really came down to a lot of detail and put a lot of information there about what's expected in terms of fire. So Regulatory Reform Order, or put to us really the fire safety part of that, came out with a couple of things. Came into force in October 2006. You can view it. The government website is listed there. So if you wanted to, you can view the details there. It's about 2,000 pages. And the whole idea of this change was to repeal about 100 different bits of law from all different standards and simply consolidate and simplify the fire safety part of that for dealing with fire safety laws, to make it a lot easier for people to understand. It's based on a self-regulation with risk assessment approach, and it's supported by the equivalent or the Building Approved Document B and the latest British standards. So, if we're looking at fire alarms within buildings, it's a good place to start and look at what's expected. We talk about risk assessments, and yes, risk assessments need to be carried out. There's lots of risk assessment companies out there, but the government also puts guidance documents out there as well. In total, there's about 11 bits of guidance. We can just see 3 of them there. There's one for sleeping accommodation, one for theatres, cinemas and similar premises, and there's one there for factories. So basically, you find that the government isn't leaving you on your own and say, get on with it. They're saying there are some guidance here, speak to the specialists as well, but the basics are in this guidance. But who does that affect? Well, if you're an employer, the owner, the landlord or an occupier, or anyone with control of a premises, so that could be facilities manager, building manager, a contractor, anyone that's got a degree of control over a premises, then it affects you. Okay, you need to understand that the risk assessment can affect you and the regulatory reform order can affect you as well. So pulling the key items out of that regulatory reform order, it identifies the need to carry out a full risk assessment. It identifies the responsible person, and we'll touch on that briefly on the next slide or so. So owners or occupiers will be responsible for provision of the ongoing maintenance of the appropriate firefighting and fire detection equipment. The fire service will remain an enforcing authority, so they have powers to search documentation or to check documentation. And any offence under the new Act will hold a responsible person accountable, and that is a named person. The British standards themselves also talk about responsible person. It just says it's a single named member of the premises management, so it's saying here named, should be appointed to supervise all matters pertaining to the fire detection and fire alarm system. This person should normally be the keeper of the documentation as described in clause 40 and given sufficient authority to carry out the following duties. And then it kind of lists several duties they need to carry out. We've highlighted one because it has a big impact on what the next video we're about to see. It says ensuring that where necessary, a suitable diagrammatic, and that's key, diagrammatic zone plan is displayed and kept up to date. So that's kind of key. You need to have a zone plan. If you've got a fire alarm system now, as of 2013, everywhere there's a fire alarm panel needs to have a diagrammatic zone plan. If it doesn't have that, it's classed as a major non-compliance. If you want further information on the user responsibilities, the FIA, the Fire Industry Association, also produced a document called the Fire Safety Law, and we'll just put a little link there. But if you go to the FIA website and go to Fire Safety Law leaflet, you'll find it there. And it says, if you're the owner of a building, the occupier, what do I need to do? It talks about risk assessments, who's responsible, what legislation and documentation you need to hold. So as well as those key documents, we've also got the standards, the relevant British standards that go hand in hand with all this. The key one for us is 5839 Part 1 2017. And many of the changes that we saw in 2013 and 2017 version of this document relate to the exact videos or what happened within the videos we're about to watch. If you look after NHS properties, they've got their own fire code there, and we've just listed some of the key ones that you might come across on your day-to-day travels looking at fire assessment. But the key ones really 5839 Part 1. So we're now going to link on to the second video now, and we're going to have a look at the defects as we go through the building. Just as we fly through the building, try and see what what stands out as defects within the building itself. The vis volume, he doesn't talk until we get round the corner.
This is a photograph taken of the actual alarm panel. It was a new panel which was recently installed prior to the fire. None of the staff were trained on how to interpret the information from it. Staff on duty that night had never received any fire drill training, and there was no written evacuation plan. The alarm zone plan contained text only and no plan showing each area within the building. The text provided was ambiguous and confusing. Zone boundaries did not align with fire compartment boundaries. On the upper floor, the zones were split into Zone 1 at the front entrance, Zone 2 in the middle, and Zone 3 at the rear. Fire alarm zones crossed the fire boundaries. The fire doors were ill-fitting and left gaps. There were breaks in roof space compartmentation. Fire dampeners were not installed in the ventilation system. This allowed smoke to pass through unobstructed to each outlet in the building. Bedroom doors were routinely wedged open or had their self-closers disabled. There was a number of items stored and left in the corridor, such as tables, bath and wheelchairs. There was extra load placed on the electrical system as a result of the by washroom. The cupboard doors were not locked shut. This cupboard housed the sub-electrical switches. Also stored here were combustible materials and aerosol cans.
Okay, so that just gives a brief overview of the building itself and some of the bits that were wrongly in there. So some of the bits we picked up on there, we talked about the zoning on the panel was confusing and text only. And as you'll see as we go into the next video of the actual fire itself, they think it's in the wrong place. Well, attached to this slide, if you can see it clearly enough, is the zone chart we talked about earlier. And you take something like Zone 4 that just says lower ground. It says rooms from lift shaft to corner. So imagine now you're a fire person. You've walked in there and you're faced with that. There's a fire in Zone 4. It's from the lift shaft to the corner. Well, one, where's the lift? And secondly, which corner is it referring to? So which is why it's key about the zonal detection, zonal diagram we talked about earlier. It has to be diagrammatic. Talked about fire detections crossing zones and the compartment boundaries. Said there was limited staff training. Doors were wedged open. That's a key one I see far too often. And fire doors that weren't wedged open had gaps. There's breaks in the roof space compartmentation and no ventilation dampers installed in there. Obstructions in corridors, another one that we're all probably all too familiar with. Extra electrical load as part of, I think he says, a bio washroom, and combustible materials in the electric switchboard. So not on their own, each one of those probably isn't what you wouldn't see as a major issue. However, put them together, put a fire in there, and things start going wrong. So we're just going to go on to the next video now, video number 3, and this is the kind of the longest video, and it's really how the fire started, what the staff did, what the fire service did. Can be quite upsetting in certain places when you see what happened, but the key takeaways for me to look at is we know the fire brigade can get there in under 2 minutes. Just have a look at the time it takes for the people within the care home to discover that it's a real fire. Have a look at the time it takes them to call the fire service. Have another look at the time it takes before they find the real area of fire, because there's confusion about where the fire is to start off with. And then we know the fire service can get there in 2 minutes if called on time. See how long it takes them to first walk through the door. I think you'll find all of these are shocking answers to what you're about to see.
The fire started at 4:25 a.m. in the cupboard on the upper floor. This was due to arcing activity occurring at the cabling in the electrical switch. The arcing occurred at the cable to the laundry room. Incendive sparks were ejected onto the surrounding combustible material. The fire took hold of the material and spread throughout the cupboard. The cupboard door was not correctly shut, allowing smoke to enter the corridor. The aerosol cans exploded due to heat from the fire. The cupboard doors were blown wide open and smoke billowed out into the corridor. Smoke quickly filled corridors 4A and 4B. The self-closing fire door between corridor 3 and 4A, which was held open by a magnet, would have de-energised on the actuation of the alarm. It is understood that this was almost certainly in working order. It would have closed on first alarm, but was ill-fitting and left a gap. Breaks and compartmentation within the roof space contributed to the spread of smoke across fire breaks. By this point, smoke had filled most of Zone 3. Rooms which had their doors wedged open or their closing mechanism disabled would have been completely filled by smoke. Due to high concentration of asphyxiant gases, the residents within would have succumbed to the toxicity. Only 2 of the doors in this area were closed. The residents of these rooms survived in the initial fire but later passed away in hospital. Smoke spread through the ventilation system due to the lack of fire dampeners. Between 7 and 10 minutes, the fire would have been at its most severe. Those that perished in the care home that night would have by this time. This was 14 minutes after the ignition of the fire and 3 minutes before the arrival of the first firefighter. All fatalities had their bedroom doors open. 2 residents who had their doors closed in corridor 4 and 2 residents in corridor 3 who had their doors open died later in hospital. At 17 minutes, the fire service arrived on scene. The fire was almost out by now due to the lack of oxygen. Prior to the fire, staff were involved in general care duties, including changing dressings and putting residents to bed throughout the home. There were no reports of residents smoking in their rooms, nor had there ever been. A member of staff retrieved a toilet roll from the cupboard of fire origin. On the lower floor, there was an agitated resident who required assistance from the staff. Fire started at 4:25 a.m. after arcing in the electrical switch room on the upper floor. This subsequently ignited the combustible material contained within the cupboard. While administering care to a resident who had bumped their head, staff heard the fire alarm and made their way to the fire panel. Additional staff members joined the others at the alarm panel. There is confusion over the correct zone shown on the panel. It was a new alarm. No one was familiar with it and they were unsure over what the staff's actions should be. A male member of staff thought the matron said the fire was in the area they were occupying, which further added to the confusion. One female member of staff checks the rooms from the alarm panel up to the lift shaft. 2 female members of staff check the lower floor and are joined by the 3rd female staff member shortly after. They find no signs of smoke or fire in any of the rooms on the lower floor. The 3 female staff members go back to the alarm panel to join up with the male member of staff. He thought that the matron said it must be a false alarm. He then checks the rooms in the vicinity of the alarm panel and subsequently some residents are then moved into the day room. The alarm panel is reset by staff and immediately reactuates. The male member of staff continues along corridor 2 towards the lift area and sees dense smoke. He and a female member of staff then try to help residents on the upper level by proceeding to the fire stairs on the lower level. They are prevented from using the fire stairs due to smoke and can hear the sounds of fire behind the door. They begin to waken residents on the lower floor in order to evacuate them. Matron makes the phone call to the fire service. Knowing the gates are locked at the rear of the building from New Edinburgh Road, she mistakenly says to enter by Rose Park Gardens. The correct approach should have been Rose Park Avenue. The evacuation of residents continues. Due to the effects of smoke inhalation, those that perished in the care home itself have done so by this time. Corridor 2 is cleared of residents who have moved into the day room. 17 minutes after the fire started, the fire service first arrive at the incident. The staff misinterpreted the alarm information and advised the initial officer in charge that the fire was in the lift shaft on the lower floor and that 2 members of staff were also down on the lower floor. Closed-circuit television recorded staff directing the OIC to the lower floor. There was no communication with the staff on the lower floor and their status was unknown. Fire service was in attendance 5 minutes after the call had been made and 17 minutes after the fire had started. The initial officer in charge was advised by staff that the fire was in the lift shaft on the lower level. There was no reason to doubt the staff's information as it was consistent with what he had gathered from his own observations. He was then advised that there were residents on the lower floor who were unaccounted for and that 2 members of staff had gone down to evacuate them. There was no communication with the staff on the lower level and their status was unknown. BA Team 1 was assigned to the lower floor. The residents on the upper floor had not been evacuated. A person's reported message was sent. Firefighters have not entered the corridor where the fire is. The officer in charge believes that the fire is contained to the lift shaft due to the recommended level of fire resistance that should have been in place. BA Team 1 on the lower floor found the residents and staff and tried to evacuate via the fire exit on the lower floor but are unable due to heavy smoke logging. BA Team 1 turn back and make their way out the building via the exit on the lower floor by the lift shaft. 16 persons in total were rescued from the lower floor. During this time period, 3 residents were also removed from their rooms in Corridor 2 on the upper floor. BA Team 1 then returned to the far stairs and proceed up to the upper floor and commence a right-hand search. Assistance message, make pumps 3, enter via Rose Park Avenue, was sent. Officer in charge is now aware that the fire is not contained to the lift shaft and that smoke has spread beyond this. Staff were unable to provide the OIC with accurate information as to who has been rescued and who was still missing. The first ambulance arrives at the incident. On the upper floor, BA Team 2 proceed to carry out a search and rescue from the lift shaft into Corridor 3. They zigzag from room to room, finding residents in each. A second ambulance arrives at the incident. BA Team 1 proceed along Corridor 4B from the far stairs and search each room, finding several casualties that show no signs of life. They attempt to rescue a casualty who showed signs of life but became entangled in collapsed ventilation ducting that was hanging down from the ceiling. BA Team 1 are released with the assistance of BA Team 2 and the casualty is removed via the front entrance. A third ambulance arrives at the incident. Assistance message, make pumps 4, is sent. BA Team 1 are instructed to remove the earlier casualties showing no signs of life. They remove one more casualty before withdrawing due to low pressure warning whistle and physical exhaustion. BA Team 3 now enter Corridor 3 and search all rooms from the lift shaft, rescuing one casualty. They then continue searching and discover the fire's point of origin. They extinguish the smouldering fire in the cupboard using a hose reel. They then continue to search for casualties, but find none showing any signs of life. They return to BACO to report their findings. At this point, 42 out of the 44 residents and staff have been accounted for, and 9 fatalities have been identified. 7 are left in situ, 2 have been removed to an empty room away from the residents who have been rescued. BA Team 4 enter and begin searching all rooms from the lift shaft onwards. They ventilate each room as they proceed. Assistance message, make pumps 6, several possible fatalities, is sent. No appliances that are mobilised following this message take any active part in firefighting or search and rescue operations. BA Team 4 find a further 2 residents, one showing signs of life and one suspected fatality. Both are removed and this is the last casualty to be removed by fire service personnel. BA Team 5 enter. Time of entry is not clear from the fatal accident inquiry. They are initially told to remove fatalities, but this brief is changed and they are then told not to remove any of the remaining 7 fatalities.
Okay, so quite a shocking sequence of events that happens there. Some of the points I picked up earlier, just before the video, is time to take and discover a real fire. Well, in that scenario, it took them 10 minutes to discover that it was a real fire. You probably heard at the very start of the video, even the staff reset it thinking it was a false alarm. So 10 minutes for someone to actually discover that it could be a real fire is a shocking amount of time. And they also mentioned, within the first 10 minutes, that's when all the people that died had died. So time is the key of getting support to these sort of people. It took them 12 minutes to call the fire brigade. That's time wasted instantly that we could have had the fire brigade there. So the fire brigade had no chance getting there in a timely manner whatsoever. It was 28 minutes before they discovered where the actual fire was. They spent so much time believing it was in the lift shaft. It's 28 minutes later they realised that the fire is in a completely different area of the building, and that really comes down to the zone chart we talked about. And then lastly, 17 minutes for the fire brigade to walk in. Now, we know it took 12 minutes to call them and 17 minutes for them to get there, 5 minutes later for them to get there. So if they can get there under 2 minutes, why is it different? And again, we'll see that in the next video as to why there's some timers missing there as well. So, you know, if everything had been placed that we talked about before, if the zoning on the panel had been correct, if the detection zones were incorrectly with the compartmentation, the doors hadn't been wedged open, would those people have survived? Well, to be honest, hard to say, isn't it? It's impossible to say whether they've survived. But I think the fire service would have been there a lot quicker, and more people would have survived the initial fire. So the last video we're going to quickly look at now is the actual call to the fire service themselves, just to see how it was handled. And very interesting when you listen to the very, very last part of the video itself.
The call to the fire service was made at 4:37 AM and was handled by Strathclyde Fire and Rescue's Operations Support Centre in Johnson. The initial turnout sheet contained substantially more information than normal. Critical information was located further down the turnout sheet than would have normally been expected. This additional information detailed how appliances should enter by Rose Park Avenue. This was different to the address provided at the top of the turnout sheet, which directed appliances to the rear of the building. The PDA for this premises was 2 appliances. On this occasion, 1 appliance was mobilised from Bells Hill and a second from Hamilton. The first appliance arrived at the rear of the care home on New Edinburgh Road. The incident commander decided not to gain access to the main entrance via the lane. This was due to the sloping site and the risk of the appliance colliding with the eaves of the building. The incident commander climbed the gate, which was closed and locked. As he made his way up the lane, he noticed smoke issuing from a lower storey window. The appliances were relocated to the main entrance at Rose Park Avenue. At the main entrance, there is a small car park and easy access to the alarm panel. This was where staff would have expected to meet the fire service.
Okay, so last line there says, you know, it's where staff would have expected to meet the fire service. Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the fire service were not expected to meet there, because no one had told them. In fact, the nurse that gave the call to the fire brigade had actually given the wrong address, you know, which is why it's key. You know, if there's a telephone, someone's going to call the fire service, you need to have a simple, this is who you ring, this is our address, really simple, written down instructions so people can get the attention or the help they need as soon as possible. But we talked about the British standards earlier and how it changed as a direct impact of that. We've seen it already on the zonal diagram. But one of the other changes that's happened is this comment here. And I'll just read it out. It says, since the objective of a category L system, so a life safety system on a fire alarm system, is the evacuation of occupants rather than protection of the property, manual summoning of the fire and rescue service by occupants might again suffice. However, if the early attendance of the fire and rescue service is likely to be essential to the safety of life, e.g. hospitals and residential care homes, just as we saw here, a secondary automatic means of transmission might be warranted unless there are adequate arrangements to ensure that there is no delay at any time in the manual summoning of the fire and rescue service by occupants. So what it's really saying is, if you can guarantee someone will ring the fire service as soon as a fire starts, you didn't need to worry about anything. If you couldn't guarantee that, you should have an automatic dialer. That was in 2013. In 2017, they added the extra line. In practice, automatic transmission of fire alarm signals is considered necessary in the case of residential care premises. So it's really saying, if you've got a residential care premises, doesn't matter what you think, you need to put an auto dialer in there because we need to get there as soon as possible. You may want to go down the staged fire alarms, or staff alarms as sometimes known. This is where you have the alarms that tell the staff there's a fire, but you don't necessarily warn the residents. And that's really to stop duress of false alarms, but also because you may have a resident that can't or isn't mobilised themselves, so they need the staff to help them. So it's far easier to let the staff control that evacuation rather than let the patient sit there panicking that they can't move and they're waiting for it. And what it really says there is, if you're using it, staff should be, you should only use stage alarms where staff, including night staff, are sufficient in numbers and fully trained in the action they are to take. And it goes on to say there, you can delay the main alarm, but you can't delay the alarm to the staff or delay the alarm to the fire and rescue services themselves. So if you're premises management, what do you need to do? We need to carry out and record that risk assessment. Consult any of the guidance notes, especially regarding the regulatory form order. Consult other interested parties, your building control insurers, and decide on the level of protection that's required for that building. You need to consider a fire plan and document that, and appoint a third-party company to design, install, commission and service your fire alarm system. And just to touch on that, there are two schemes. There's the LPS 1014, or by the BRE, and that covers supply, install, commission and maintenance of fire alarm systems. But you have to be able to do all four to get that. There is another scheme called BAFE, SP203 or SP201 as it's sometimes known, and it's modular. So you can just do a design, you can just do an install course. But if you've got all four modules, it's pretty much the same as an LPS 1014. Another item we mentioned earlier, a standard that I popped up earlier very briefly, was 7273 Part 4, and this is about making sure door actuation of door release mechanisms close correctly in the event of a fault and the event of a fire. And you know, we see too many buildings that have got fire compartmentation correct, then we put massive doors in them and we hold them open. Well, that's only going to, your building's only going to keep its fire protection if those doors correctly close, and that's really what this document's about, to make it to make sure those doors close correctly. And why is that important? Well, if you remember in the video, 2 people survived the initial fire. The people in those rooms there, they were the only 2 people to have their doors closed. And it's the smoke that kills the majority of people. It's important that those doors are sealed correctly. So in terms of the documentation, what is it now? So previously we used to have these fire certificates that were issued by the fire brigade themselves. That is no longer the case. They don't mean anything anymore. What you have now is your fire risk assessment, which is regularly reviewed. And what is regularly? Every 6 months, if nothing changes. If things in your building change, it needs to be looked at more often than that. Make sure your fire alarm system is updated in line with the risks. Make sure you keep documentations of your fire alarm systems, of your risk assessments, for the entire life of that system. We're just going to look at one picture we found recently of a building where things had happened and the risk assessment and the fire alarm hadn't been looked at when modifications were carried out. So this is a completely compliant building until a modification was done to it. So here we have a cool point next to an emergency escape door there. You can see that that was correct originally, but someone had come along and they'd put a partition wall up there. And no thought as to how someone will now activate that cool point or even reset it. So it just shows you things like this are happening in this day and age, which is shocking to see. Documentations for all new systems. Every end user or every fire alarm user should have design certificates, installation certificates, commission certificates, and fourthly, sign off what they call an acceptance certificates. They should be there. But then it hands over to the end users themselves, and they have their own responsibilities. So in section 7 of the British Standards, it goes through them. I've picked out key items here that I think are worth knowing. Ensuring that the control and indicator equipment, the fire alarm panel, is checked at least every 24 hours to confirm there's no faults. And that's nothing more than walking by and checking the green lights on and there's no amber or red lights on it. Ensuring that arrangements are in place for the testing and maintenance of the fire alarm system. Fairly straightforward. Ensuring the logbook is kept up to date and available for inspection by any authorised person, and that could simply be the fire brigade turning up wanting to look at that. Ensuring that all the relevant occupants within that protected premises are instructed on the proper use of the system. Ensuring that the appropriate action is taken to limit the rate of false alarms. And key, one that's missed so many times, is ensuring that a clear space, at least ½ metre, is preserved in all directions around and below every fire detector, and that every manual call point remains unobstructed and conspicuous. So last couple of slides now, and I just want to really talk about the summary from this Rose Park fatal inquiry. And Sheriff Brian Lockhart said the following things. Hopefully, some or all of the deaths could have been prevented if the care home had a suitable and sufficient fire safety plan. Management did not have proper appreciation of its role and responsibilities in relation to the issues of fire safety. It was absolutely essential that the fire brigade were called as soon as the alarm sounded, not 12 minutes later. A further serious deficiency was found in the limited attention given to how residents would escape from the home in the event of fire. Inadequate arrangements for calling the fire brigade, lack of fire dampeners, and too many people being housed in one corridor caused part of this issue. And to finish, he said, had the defects been discovered during inspections by the health board, the fire brigade would have been called immediately, the staff would have acted appropriately when the fire alarm sounded, and the bedroom doors would have been shut. And to be honest, the next slide, of all the slides you've seen, of all the videos you've seen, I think the next slide is by far the most shocking. And that is that no one was prosecuted over the Rose Park incident due to the legislation that was in place back then. And it's to me, every time I see that, it still shocks me to this day that the people that were at fault over this walked away from this. But that's due to legislation that was in place then. There's lots of legislation in place now that we need to be aware of. And here's one, a latest one. And this is a co-op had been fined more than £200,000 in Southampton for breaching the fire safety regulations. And what were these regulations? No one died. They didn't have a fire. But again, rear emergency doors were locked, exit doors using security code, fire alarms were not tested regularly, the cool points were obstructed, and we see that far too often in this sort of shop, and the store manager was not up to date with fire safety training. So, the legislation is in place now, people are being fined. And that was kind of really the first one that we saw. Since then, there's been many that are out there. So B&M Retail, New Look, Celebrity Hairdressers, landlords, pubs, Greggs, Asda, all these people have been fined £30,000, £40,000 for breaching fire safety legislation. The only one that's different from that is the New Look one, who were fined £400,000, as you can see, and that's because they did actually have a fire. So, we're not finding people having fire. So why were the fines so high? Well, in this scenario, the staff continued to serve customers throughout that, well, not throughout the fire, when the fire started. And it wasn't anyone in the shop that called the fire brigade. It was actually people from outside calling the fire brigade to say, do you realise that there's a fire and New Look's in fire? So we still see it this day, but hopefully the legislation is helping this to become a thing of the past. So really, we finish on the same slide we started. The key of all of this is risk assessment, design with the compliance to the relevant standards. Make sure we identify the correct fire alarm system for the application. Look at the fire evacuation plan. Make sure it's commissioned correctly. Make sure staff are trained. It all comes down to training of staff. Maintain the system correctly and adapt the fire system certainly as the building or the occupants in that building change. And with that, I'm open for questions.
Great, thank you so much for that, Neil. That was really insightful. Really good to sort of see the detailed analysis of such a tragic event.
Shocking event.
Yeah, most definitely. We have got a few questions that have come in. So as usual, everybody, if you'd like to ask any more, please do. But I'll start off with a question from David. What are your thoughts on stay put policy?
Defend in place policy. Do you know what? I think it's a good policy. If the buildings are designed correctly and the compartmentation is correct, it is the best way forward, because a lot of these buildings, you can't evacuate everyone down the staircases. So I think it's a great policy. My only concern is these buildings are put together by the cheapest bidder in a lot of places. And are you going to risk your life believing that the cheapest bidder has done everything they possibly needed to? Yes, they're good, but I also think we need a backstop. If you need to evacuate people, there needs to be some sort of system in there, what we call an 8629 system, that will evacuate people when you need to. So stay put's great, but I think there needs to be additional standards to evacuate people if you need to evacuate everyone.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Luid. Who would be at fault due to the zones breaching fire stops? Would it be the installers? ?
Really, it's down to whoever designed the fire alarm system. Really, that's the fire alarm zoning should have been down to the fire alarm specialist, but it could have been a consultant that did that. So this is where the kind of, not the blame game, but it comes in. Did the fire alarm was it installed on a set of drawings that were provided by a consultant, or was the fire alarm a specialist that was supposed to have gone in and sorted that out? A lot of time, these definitions of where it lies as to whose responsibility it is get blurred. So from my point of view, it should be, if the consultant's going to do the design and they're going to sign it, fair enough. If they're not sure and you want to do a kind of a guidance document, you need to clearly state that the fire alarm specialist is the specialist, and they will be coming up with a cause and effect plan. It's down to risk assessment. Everyone needs to get involved in that. It's not a straight.
Yeah, I can probably back that up as well, Neil. Coming from the installation side, we obviously quite often get drawings from consultants, and then our design specialists then go through that in a bit more detail and actually identify some of the more specialist areas that they need to consider.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Karina. Are these type of buildings inspected often to check compliance with fire regulation?
No. So I believe certainly care homes have a different set of regulation. I think they are inspected more often, but really, if you're talking blocks of flats, that is really building control as when it gets signed over, and that's it. And this is why the risk assessment is so key. It's up to the landlord then to be carrying out the risk assessment and making sure any changes are in line with that risk assessment. So it really is a blame game, unfortunately, these days. And I talk about risk assessment so much. It's a key document, but unfortunately, the amount of jobs I look at these days, and you go, if you've got a risk assessment, and the glazed look that people give, you go, no. Without that, it's a key document. It's, you know, you can't have a building without one these days. So yeah, absolutely.
And what I suppose the other side of that is if there's any change to that building, usage, extensions, layout, that every time that should be a new fire risk assessment, as far as I'm concerned, because the whole plan could change. The signage could be different, where extinguishers need to go, detection, etc.
Absolutely, totally agree. Yeah,
there's definitely
good question.
We've got a question from guest. Why aren't fire doors fitted with an alarm if they are not closed? This could be a visual on the main control panel.
Could be, and I think people have looked into the past. But the thing is, you take a hotel, in many office blocks, doors are held open all the time. You could have an alarm on the panel, but it would just simply be missed after a while. People go, oh, it's that bloody alarm going off again. They just ignore it. So that's why the standard came in, not to say it's open, to make sure that the doors close on the event of fault, fail safe on the event of fault or a fire. And that's really why the standard's there. So we don't have to worry about that. We expect the doors to close because that's what the standards say they should do.
Yeah. And then we've got a question in from Freddie. Are smoke alarms still advised in kitchen areas, or are heat detectors considered the acceptable norm now?
I would never consider putting a smoke alarm in a kitchen at all. Heat detectors, yeah, definitely the norm in a kitchen. So when it comes to safety of life, it says, you know, smoke's the best thing. It's the smoke that kills people, but we have to minimise false alarms as well. So a heat detector is the correct way to go on a kitchen, definitely.
And if there's another area that doesn't suit potentially a smoke detector, the other options are beams.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the technology that's out there these days, you know, take shower rooms, for example. Previously, you'd never put a smoke detector in there, but there are smoke detectors today that can eliminate or ignore steam. They look for smoke only. So carbon monoxide sensors, there's lots of technology out there. And that's really where, you know, TH White's come in and say, here's your building. This is the detector I'd recommend for that area.
It's worth highlighting as well that there are suppression systems that are put in place. So obviously you've got fire extinguishers, you've got mist systems, you've got sprinkler systems, etc. So on. So not only do you have the notifications of the alarm systems that are put in place, but obviously you've got all these other elements that sort of come to sort of reduce potential hazards, etc. We've got a question in from Irene. How many parties are involved in the periodic review of risk assessments, statutory or voluntary?
Right. So risk assessment, one of the bits I took out to comply with time, but risk assessment. So a risk assessment has to be done on every building. OK, you only need a written risk assessment if it has more than 4 people in it, which I find shocking. You know, if you're going to do a risk assessment, write it down. It's you know, why wouldn't you? So how often should it be reviewed, that side of things? There's no real guidance to it. My personal thing is, if the building doesn't change, it should be done every 6 months, just to make sure it's still in line. If, as Carl mentioned, if anything changed that building, an occupant, a new door, anything changed, the risk assessment should be reviewed again. And that's statutory. In reality, the guidance, you have to do a risk assessment and it should be regularly reviewed. That's all it says. Who does that? It's totally up to you. If you're competent as a competent person to do that as an end user, do it. no problem at all. If you're not competent, you can get third-party accredited companies to come and do that for you. But I'd always recommend that the end user and the risk assessment go around together, because no one knows that that building better than the landlord themselves or the residents within there. So who should be involved? It's impossible to say. It just needs a risk assessment and needs to be kept up to date. That's the only guidance there is. So I know it's not a straight, clear cut, but if you're worried about it, every 6 months I would do. And if you don't think you're competent in doing it, get a specialist in to assist you with that.
We've got a question in from Doigu. My son is in a 3-story house with 8 more students. House is not a HMO. It has 2 kitchen doors wedged and no fire doors to bedrooms, just smoke strips. Who is responsible? Question mark. Estate agents? Question
The
mark.
landlord is ultimately responsible. It's their building.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess you want to have
sorry.
you want to have a direct route to the landlord, so it would be through the estate agent. You'd have to lodge your information through the estate agent. Absolutely.
And I'll just throw in a final question. What's your opinion? Obviously, a lot of things that you've highlighted appear to have been things that could have been addressed at the design stage.
Yes.
And then obviously then they're quite shortly afterwards could have been addressed on site with the contractor. So what are your thoughts in regard to sort of procedure and process at that time? Firstly, obviously, I presume the drawings would have been assessed as a full plans sort of review with building control, and then obviously then on site with maybe a clerk of works or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets a bit confusing. So we've seen it before where a consultant will put an indicative price down. So an indicative design down on a drawing. That drawing then will be passed to electrical contractors or main building contractors, and then to electrical contractors. So probably 5 or 10 different companies. It will then, for some reason, always be left to the last minute, and it'll be dropped on a fire alarm specialist, and they'll go, "We need a fire alarm for this building." The fire alarm specialist will look at that and go, "Oh, thank God, it's already been designed. I'll just price it up and no problem whatsoever." It then gets priced up. They win the job, and then they install to that. And at the end of it, someone says, "Right, I need a design certificate." And the fire alarm specialist says, "We didn't design it." And the consultant go, "Well, we didn't want to take design responsibility. We were doing indicative," but no one's mentioned that anywhere through it. So at the end of so many jobs, people go, "We're not signing it. We didn't do anything to do with that." The key bit is it's listed at the start. So if a consultant is doing a design and it's just indicative, put that on the drawings, clearly label fire alarm specialist to sign off design. And then the fire alarm specialist can look at that and go, "Right, this is what they're after. This is where it's going," and ask the correct questions.
Great, thank you. So as you can see, I've popped up our advert for this talk again. So thank you again for Carl from TH White and Neil from Honeywell for the CPD in 43. This along with all other CPDs that were recorded should be available on the SIA YouTube page. You should be able to just simply search SIA Wessex region meeting, and these should come up. We've currently only got 2 that have been uploaded, but I have been promised by central office that the remainder of these will be uploaded in due course. So just to highlight our next 3 events, which are likely to be the last events for 2021. You should start to see advertisements for our 2022 calendar in due course. However, the 3 events that we have coming up, one which has already been published is Savills, which is planning and regeneration update. That will be an in-depth sort of review of the things that have changed in the planning sphere and things that have been updated, for example, with the MPPF, etc. So that will be on Wednesday, the 29th of September. So please do sign up for that, and we look forward to seeing you then. The next 2 events is Autodesk, which will be these are all CPD in 43 series events. The journey from design automation to generative design should be really interesting. A key individual from Autodesk will be presenting this. So I'm really looking forward to that. Wednesday, 13th of October. So please add that to your diary as well. And then, as mentioned at the beginning, we're with fire safety and fire design being such a sort of a very important and topical element, is particularly at this time with changes to standards, etc., happening. We've asked a consultant, fire specialist consultant, Hydrock, to also come along following our talk with THY and Honeywell. They will be going into sort of guidance, legislation and common design issues, and that is on Wednesday the 17th of November. So please do add that to your diary as well. The latter two are yet to be advertised, but please tentatively add it to your diary so you don't double book, and we look forward to seeing you at those events. So all we have left to do is obviously highlight that thank you for coming along to SciArt Wessex Region, another SciArt Wessex Region CPD in 43 event. Thank you again to Carl, thank you again to Neil, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Please do get in touch with us directly if you'd like us to hold any other events, any other ideas, if you'd like more deeper events. So for example, obviously we're doing these CPD in 43s, which are quick lunchtime events. If you'd like more in-depth events, please do let us know, and then hopefully at some point in the near future we might be able to have some face-to-face events. So please do keep a look at on our Eventbrite page. You should see everything being posted on there, and also please do follow us on Instagram and Facebook. So thank you again. And I will sign off, and just in case Carl and Neil want to say anything, then I'll leave a couple of seconds for them as well.
No, thank you.
No,
Just from me, thank you for attending. Much, you know, I know time's precious, so thank you for spending your last kind of hour with us. Much appreciated.
Yeah, and I mirror that. Yeah, thank you very much. And obviously, if you need any sort of further advice or guidance around sort of design and installation of fire alarms, then please feel to get in touch.